Hi, I'm Stephen Bowie, and this is an interview with Loring Mandel for the Archive of American Television. This is June 15th, 2010, and we're in Somers, New York. Hi. Before we get to your television work, we're just going to take a few minutes to ask you about your early years.
Sure.
Can you tell me your full name that you were born with?
Loring Darwin Mandel.
That's Darwin as in Charles Darwin?
Yes, my father was a doctor. He admired Charles Darwin, and so he gave me that as a middle name. And between my first name and my middle name, it was hell in school.
Where were you born?
Chicago.
And can you tell us the date?
May 5th, 1928.
And did you grow up in Chicago?
I did. Chicago Public Schools, University of Wisconsin.
And what did your mother do?
My mother was a housewife.
Did you have siblings?
I have an older sister, and I had a younger brother who passed away a few years ago.
When you were growing up, what did you want to be?
I think I was first attracted to the radio. We had our own little closed-circuit radio station in our apartment, and I used to produce broadcasts. The name of the station was WCLR, C for Charlotte, L for Loring, R for Richard, and I started writing scripts when I was 6.
So these would actually be shows that you would broadcast on?
On our little closed-circuit station, yes. But I did this never thinking it was going to be a career. I thought of this as what I did for fun.
Huh. And when did you start to think that it might be a profession?
It became a profession when I needed money to go to graduate school. I had a degree at Wisconsin which allowed me to be in all kinds of subjects with no real concentration except a lot of drama and a lot of writing. But I also audited in the music school and in the graduate program of the music school at Wisconsin. And my plan was to go to graduate school in music at Northwestern and get a job as a composer or teacher in some college faculty. But since I had no real undergraduate credits in music from Wisconsin, I would have had to take a double course. The undergraduate program at Northwestern, where I was accepted, and the graduate, which I was accepted at. And I couldn't do both. I didn't have money. So I got a job writing coming attractions for motion pictures. I was, at the time, a student arranger, like an intern, at the studio orchestra of Rex Maupin at the American Broadcasting Company in Chicago. I was arranging for them. And so I got to know all of the people at ABC, which was on one floor of the Merchandise Mart, and NBC, which was at the other floor of the Merchandise Mart. So I knew all those people. I knew Bert Tillstrom, I knew Garraway, of course, and others. And one day someone said to me, we have a client on the radio whose sponsor wants to put him on television. Could you develop a show over the weekend? And I did. And it was a variety show, sort of like the local version of Arthur Godfrey's show. And so that started going on. And it suddenly occurred to me that I could do for a living what I'd done all this time for fun. So I never did get back to Northwestern, and I never did have a career in music.
So, well, tell me, what was that first show that you developed that you mentioned for the client?
It was called Norman Ross at Work. Norman Ross was a disc jockey in Chicago, classical music. It's the Northwestern Hour, it was called, for the Northwestern Railroad. And Norman was a huge man who had been an Olympic swimming champion and a very engaging talker. And so I wrote commentary for him.
And so you started writing in radio while you were still in college, and then moved into it full time?
Yes, but I was writing his television show.
Oh, okay. All right. So that was...
Norman Ross at Work was a television show, 3 days a week in the afternoon. And then people started asking me to write other television shows for them. And I ended up working at W.B. Donor and Company, an advertising agency in Chicago, writing all of their local television shows.
And what were some of those shows? Do you remember?
Well, Request Performance with Irv Kupcinet was one. There was one that was a terrible show. It was actually a wedding on television. The Tavern Pail was the beer sponsor, and Mike Wallace was the announcer. I did the commercials, and there was something called the Nash Air Flight Review that I wrote with Ski Wolf. I wrote radio show, which was the follower of the Gene Autry radio show. There was a show called Curly Bradley, the Singing Marshal, and I wrote one or two of those. Curly Bradley was also a cowboy, and he was a singer, and the idea of the show was somehow he would catch the villain by singing. It was a little difficult.
So you were doing radio and television simultaneously?
Yes, yeah.
What was it like to write those scripts? Was there a lot of pressure? I mean, were there tight deadlines? Tell me about how you were writing.
No, the only deadline was the air date, because nobody really knew what they were doing. There was very little in the way of a structure. NBC in Chicago, which spawned a lot of good people like Garraway and Bill Hoban, the director, and Dan Petrie, the director, and so on. There was no structure. One guy had to say, yeah, that's good, and it went on. There was nothing like standard practices. Came along later and rather fiercely.
And what was the production like?
Productions were terrific. There was a Chicago style of production. If you look at the Garraway shows, you'll see that they don't hide the fact that it's in the studio. They make the studio part of the show. And so a whole level of artifice disappears, and it becomes much more interesting visually. Of course, in New York, the style was much more theatrical. But Chicago had its own television style, and it was a lot of fun. It really was a lot of fun to work.
I want to go back and ask about a couple of the people you mentioned.
Okay.
Tell me about working with Irv Kupcinet.
Irv Kupcinet was a force. He was the Chicago version of Ed Sullivan. He wrote a gossip column, and he got all of the major talent that came through Chicago appeared on his show. Eddie Cantor, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, Eddie Durant, Jimmy Durante, and all of those people, they appeared on his show for nothing. As a matter of fact, the only one who didn't was Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. came to Chicago. He was with the Will Maston Trio, and they were performing at the Chez Paris. And I was writing all the material for all these people. And so I went to see him, and he was doing impressions at the time, and so we thought he'd be doing that on the Cup show. He got to the studio, and while we were waiting to go onto the air, he turned to the producer and he said, "How much am I getting paid?" And the producer said, "Well, you know, it's for Cup." And he said, "Yeah, I know it's for Cup, but how much am I getting paid?" And they said, "Well, we don't pay them, any of the people who come on for Cup." And Sammy Davis said, "If I'm not worth being paid, I'm not worth going on." So they gave him $200 and he came on the show. But he was the only one. I thought that was terrific.
So when you were writing material for these performers, were you interacting with them?
Yes, sure.
Is there anyone else in particular that stands out?
Well, Bob Hope was very interesting. and he relied on writers very heavily, and he was critical of what you did. I mean, if he didn't think it was good, he wouldn't do it. But he was very respectful of writers. People like Eddie Cantor, they just did it and went away.
And you worked with Dave Garroway. What was that?
I started when I was in college, sending material to his disc jockey show on radio in Chicago on WMAQ. It was called the 1160 Club. And Dave Garroway was a man who had specialized in astronomy at Harvard and had a plan to eventually move to Hawaii and become an astronomer. And he was making money in the meantime being on the radio. And he was playing jazz records. And he asked on his show if you had a record you wanted him to play, let him know. And if he wanted to play it, he'd play it and invite you to come down and be on the show when he did. And so my roommate and I went to Chicago. He played the record that I had asked for. It was Jada by Bobby Hackett. And we were on the show, the whole show. And it was quite interesting because while the show was playing the music, Garroway would talk to us and he'd say, "You're speaking too fast. At this time of night, you should be speaking at so many words per minute. Bring your voice down a little bit. Use words like these, not words like those." He had created a personality for himself on the air that was not the Dave Garroway that talked to when the music was playing. He had two personalities. And I think what happened to him eventually was that the fabricated personality took over. He had a very weird afterlife. The last time I saw Dave Garroway is when I interviewed him for a show called I Remember Illinois. And we interviewed him on the roof of the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. At that time, Garroway had recorders in every room of his apartment because he was convinced that he would be intercepting messages from outer space. I mean, he was off the rails. But a most interesting, very, very bright man. The announcer on his disc jockey show was Hugh Downs. And when I wrote about Garroway in the Television Quarterly, I wrote to Hugh Downs. I told him what I wanted to write and asked him if he would verify it, which he did. So I didn't feel that I was being false about him.
And can you talk about, you wrote some material for Garroway, is that right?
There were mostly jokes having to do with jazz, though not anything I'd be proud to have my name on. You know, I was writing false names for records. There was a very popular very popular record at the time called It Must Be Jelly, because Jam don't shake like that. So I gave him It Must Be Shelley, because Sam don't shake like. I mean, I was in college.
And Mike Wallace, did you work with him?
Mike Wallace was the announcer on many of the shows that W.B. Donor produced in Chicago. And then he moved to doing a show with his wife, Buff Cobb, from the Chez Paris. And it became sort of a couple talking and interviewing celebrities. And eventually he moved to New York. When I first came to New York after I got out of the Army, I went to see Mike. And I said, I want to get started writing here. Is there any advice you can give me? And Mike said, look, I've never seen any plays of yours. He said, I don't know whether you're a good writer or a bad writer. He said, I'll send you to my agent, and then it's all up to you. And he did, and that really started things for me.
Can I ask, so you spent a few years in the Army, and then what made you go to New York instead of back to Chicago?
Because everybody I knew in the business in Chicago was now in New York. And the man who had been my mentor, Ski Wolf, Perry Wolf, had moved to New York. And I had decided that I definitely wanted to be in television because when I was in Chicago, before I went in the Army, there was the Kefauver hearings came to Chicago. And for 4 days, the entire city did nothing but watch television. And I said to myself, if I want to influence things, this is obviously the most influential medium to be in. And so I came to New York because that's where the headquarters of television was when I got out of the Army. That was before it moved to the West.
And so Mike Wallace introduced you to an agent.
Ted Ashley.
Ted Ashley. Tell me about him. He was sort of an important figure.
Ted Ashley was even shorter than I am, which made me feel very good. And he had a very small agency on 48th and 5th Avenue in New York. It was one other agent plus his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law was named Leonard Sitomer, and he gave me to Leonard Sitomer and said, do what you can. So Leonard said, what have you got that I can send around? And I had written 2 scripts on spec, half-hour scripts. And he said, I'll send them around and we'll see if anybody is interested. We sent them around and a month passed, 2 months passed, and I got no word back. So I went in to see Sitomer and I said, what happened with the scripts? And he said, well, they've kept them a very long time, but they finally turned them down. And I said, well, if they kept them a very long time, there must be something there that they saw. And maybe I should go and talk to them and find out what it was they liked about what they read and what it was they didn't. And consequently, he set up those appointments. I went to see Florence Britton at Studio One, and she said, we liked your script very much, but it violated 4 taboos. It was rural instead of urban. It was a fantasy rather than reality. It was a comedy rather than a drama. I forget what the other one was. But
why were they, did she explain why those were taboos?
I guess that was what the advertising agency said they wanted. Anyway, she said, what would you like to write? And I said, actually, there was a very interesting sinking of the Squalus off of New London a few years ago, and I'd like to write about that. And they ultimately hired me to do it. The other place they sent me to was Kraft Theater. I met with their story editor. His name was Arthur Heineman, and he said, we liked your script, but we can't do it. What would you like to write about? And since I'd already talked to Studio One, I didn't want to mention the same thing. So I said, I want to write a story based on the life of Leadbelly. And he said, great idea. He said, I love that. I love that material. I loved the story of Leadbelly.
And just briefly, Leadbelly was
a folk singer. Goodnight Irene was one of his. He had been arrested for murder and imprisoned. And a musicologist, 2 musicologists, John and Alan Lomax, managed to get him out of prison. And so he said, we're going to have to do 2 things. Arthur Heineman said, we're going to have to make him white, and we're going to have to forget all about the murder. And I said, I don't think it's much of a show I want to do.
So those were constraints that were necessary
he
for
said,
television.
Yeah, well, that was McCarthy time. He said the whole thing, the whole folk singing thing is left wing. He said, we have to be very careful on how we deal with that.
So it sounds like people in his position were accustomed to making compromises.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There were very few really brave people around. Susskind was one of the brave people. John Houseman was one of the brave people. They hired blacklisted actors when nobody else would.
I want to ask you more about the blacklist, and I want to get back to the Squalus story. But first, let me jump backward because I think we skipped over something called something involving Ski Wolf.
when I got out of college and looking for money to finance graduate school, there was one building in the Loop in Chicago that had most of the production companies and advertising agencies. And it was 23 stories high. And I collected everything I had ever written, and the copies of them as well. And I went to the top floor of that building, and over a period of 3 days, I knocked on every door. And I met some people who I later, actually W.B. Donor ended up hiring me, and they worked at that building. But I met someone there who sent me to people he knew, and one of them was Perry Wolf. Perry Wolf was producing shows, mostly musical shows, for WBBM radio. And I showed him some of my writing, and he liked it. And when he found out that I could read musical score, he tried to get CBS, the WBM, to hire me to direct one of his musical programs. They wouldn't hire me. I was 21 years old. But Ski took an interest in my writing, and always he sent me to other people, and he became kind of a mentor for me. And when I got out of the Army, Ski was producing a show for CBS News division called Adventure from the American Museum of Natural History, and he hired me to do some episodes until I got my feet on the ground.
To write some episodes?
Yes, yes.
Can you describe the content of what you were writing?
I wrote one about an African tribe called the Wanderobo, who had a symbiotic relationship with the honeybee. And the Wanderobo found the nests, and they protected the bees, and the bees in turn gave them honey. And then there was an anthropologist who was connected, who was on the staff of the museum, who was the spokesman on the show. The other show I did was actually a fantasy. Ski's wife, Tuliki, was a secretary at the Adventure show. And the offices were in the museum. And we did a fantasy about her leaving work late at night, going through the museum where the exhibits sort of come to life. And it becomes kind of frightening. The fellow who produced that episode was Jack Venza, who later became the king of public television and production at WNET in New York.
So, I mean, the first show you mentioned, was that a straight documentary?
Yes.
Was that filmed or live, or how was it done? Tell me.
They were all done live. They were all done live with amazing performers. John Collingwood. Is it John? Charles Collingwood was incredible. I remember he was interviewing Peter Freuchen, who was a very long-winded person like I am, and suddenly Collingwood was given a 30-second sign. He had to end the interview. Freuchen was in the middle of this long story, and somehow in 30 seconds exactly, Collingwood was able to not seem to interrupt and just wind the whole thing up and bring it to a point just 30 seconds. It really was amazing to watch them work.
Well, I mean, that is a skill. I'm impressed. Did you get to know Collingwood well at all?
No. I got to know Shad Northshield well. Shad he had been a picture editor for the Chicago Daily Times, and a friend of Ski's who Ski brought to New York to work on Adventure. Shad eventually produced the Today Show for some time, and ultimately became the creator and producer of CBS Sunday Morning.
Is that Robert Northshield?
Yes. Shad was how we knew him.
And would you say that, why would you say that Perry Wolf is an important figure in television, if you know?
When he was still in Chicago, he and a man at NBC Development named Ben Park really started the whole tape documentary. It was a radio format, and they did a number of very powerful shows. There was no television tape at the time, and it really was a format that Ski developed. He came to New York and he became a mainstay at CBS News in New York for many, many years. Finally retired.
Well, let me go back to Studio One.
I know we're hopping around a lot.
No, that's right. Yeah. Well, the the adventure was while you were looking for. So, would you say, I mean, while you were doing adventure and showing them to you, were you consciously trying to get into the dramatic anthologies?
Oh yes, absolutely. That's when I was writing my spec scripts. And
why those particular shows? Why Studio One and Craft?
well, those were the ones that Leonard Satomer had sent my spec scripts to.
Well, why the hour-long dramatic anthology?
Well, that was where all the creative work seemed to be done. They were wonderful shows. I mean, they may not look wonderful now when you see the old kinescopes, but you have to view them in the perspective of the time, and it was very powerful, and it was live, and live television had a capacity that it's really lost. And that capacity was the capacity to be surprising, because once it became film and tape, you know that what you're seeing has been manipulated. But in live television, it couldn't be manipulated. Whatever it was going to be, it was. And to a certain extent, you sat on the edge of your seat when you watched it. Also, the quality of the picture was so much more real than what you saw on film, that those electrons were coming right at you and burning into your eyes. I mean, it was very powerful. And then when they started doing film television, it was distancing.
Now, this was 1954,
55.
Were you, how aware were you of the work that Rod Serling and Patty Chayefsky and that group of writers had been doing before, ahead of you a little bit?
I was not familiar with the scripts that they did during the 2 years I was off in the Army. So when I came back in January of '54, I'd missed, for example, I think I'd missed Patty's breakaway script.
Marty.
I'd missed that. I'd missed a couple of others. I was very familiar with Rod Serling's stuff because he was the Studio One boy. And Reggie Rose was Studio One. But Chayefsky was Philco Goodyear, and that was a different network, and they didn't speak very often to one another. Richard Nash, I think, was Philco Goodyear. Horton Foote was Philco Goodyear. We all sort of came together when Playhouse 90 began.
Well, take me through that first Studio One script. How long did that take between when you pitched it and when it was on the air?
I pitched it in the fall of '55. It was accepted that I would write the script in February of, I pitched it in the fall of '54, and it was accepted that I would write the script in February of '55. I wrote the script, and it took place in a submarine. And when the Navy Department saw the script, they said they would not cooperate. And Studio One was counting on them getting a lot of equipment from the Philadelphia Naval Yard to simulate a submarine. And they asked me to go to Washington and speak to the Navy Department, which was very traumatic for me because I had been a security risk in the Army. So I did go. Nobody said anything to me. I spent 2 days talking to admirals in the submarine division. Over a weekend, I rewrote the script, Navy approved it, and it went on in November of '55. So it was a long period between the time the script was written and it actually went on the air. That I was waiting for that because that was going to be the start of my career. So that was the longest, driest period, was waiting for that script to go on the air. Westinghouse gave me a $300 bonus for the rewrite.
Because it had been going on for so long.
No, because of the rewrite I did for the Navy.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, and that was a true story?
It was based on a true story, but I had to fictionalize some elements of it.
What was, just briefly, what was the story and what did you decide to change to make it dramatic, to make it...
Well, I found it very dramatic, but these were all real people and they had lived through a traumatic thing, and that creates a legal problem. And it's about this ship, this submarine that went on its shakedown cruise and sinks, and how they rescued I think it was 23 sailors from it by the first use of the diving bell to get them up. I remember the review in the New York Times by Jack Gould, the headline, "Saved by the Bell." But there were interesting stories in the real event. For example, there was one man who was going to be the best man at another man's wedding on the crew of the real submarine, the Squalus. And during the time the ship was flooding, the man who was going to be married had to slam the door shut to keep his best friend out, knowing his best friend would be drowned. There were all kinds of little things like that. And I wanted that emotion, but I did not want to recreate that exact scenario. So I made these two men enemies rather than friends, because then I had guilt to deal with, but it was not exactly the same. Frank Schaffner directed it.
Yeah, tell me about Franklin Schaffner.
Frank became a very close friend. He directed that, and he put me up to do the television adaptation of the Caine Mutiny. But Paul Shire, who had done something in regard to the stage version, actually wrote the television script. But I did a number of things with Frank. Worked on my first film script with Frank, but that film never got made.
In the live TV, what was he like as a director?
The most organized man you ever met. He had a wicked sense of humor that was very much under wraps. His father was a missionary. Frank was born in China in a missionary family, so he had that reserve about him, but he was extremely skillful, totally prepared, great, especially working with stories that involve a lot of men and a lot of pressure, time pressure, other kinds of pressure. And if you look at his films, you see the best films are like that.
And your submarine story, what was the title of that show?
Shakedown Cruise.
And Shakedown Cruise, so you've got a flooded submarine on the sound stage for Studio One. What was that like?
We really flooded it. It was an enclosed set, and the cameras worked through openings in the wall so it could contain the water. Dick Kiley was the submarine commander, and Lee Marvin was the executive officer. And in the climactic scene, if you ever see that show, it's a fierce argument between Dick Kiley and Lee Marvin, and it was so hot in there that sweat was pouring off of them. And this one bead of sweat came down Dick Kiley's face and landed at the tip of his nose. And Kiley was shaking his head back and forth, but that little bead of sweat never came off. And when you watch it, you can't stop looking at that drop of sweat on his nose. anyway, it was a very effective show, I thought.
That sounds like an example of the kind of thing you were talking about the liveness of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were there during rehearsals during these?
Yes,
during
I was.
Shakedown Cruise?
Yes, I was.
Was it Richard Kiley or was it Lee Marvin who had the beat? Lee
was,
Marvin being the other.
No, it was Kylie.
It was Kiley. Okay.
Good Chicago boy.
Did you interact with the actors?
Yes, although only up to a point. The man who had to slam the door was an actor named Don Gordon, who's still around, I think. And Don came to me and he said, "This long speech that I have, I don't think the speech is right. I think it's working off of this emotion when I think it should be working off that emotion." I'm not being more specific because I don't remember that much about the detail of it, but I listened to it and I thought, he's right. It's a better speech. It makes more sense the way he described it. So I said, let's talk to Frank. And we went up to Frank Schaffner, and I explained to Frank what Don Gordon had said. And Frank said, all right. And then when Don went away, Frank put his arm around me and took me to the side, and he said, don't you ever talk to an actor again. He said, everything has to come through me. He was right. He was right. But I was new.
Well, generally though, in live TV, would you be present? Would there be a read-through
Yeah.
with the cast? And would your input be solicited on?
Yeah. I can only think of one time when it wasn't. No, I can think of two times. One was on the second or third show that I did for Studio One, which was a comic mystery called This Will Do Nicely. And I started laughing at the read-in. Of course, that was very unprofessional because they were my own jokes. But I couldn't stop laughing. I had to leave the room. Another time was much later.
So was Shakedown Cruise a success?
I don't even know if they took ratings. All I know is the morning after the show went on, Florence Britton called and said, we have another show for you. And it just didn't stop.
Well, let me take you quickly through the other Studio Ones you did.
Okay.
What was the next one that you did?
I think it was Fair Play. And Fair Play was an adaptation of a story from the Saturday Evening Post, and it was about a court martial. And I'm just writing a little essay about that now because there was a very well-known writer named Gilbert Seldes who wrote critical reviews and books, and he wrote the book Seven Lively Arts. And Seldes at the time was a television reviewer for the Saturday Review of Literature. And he reviewed Fair Play and said it was guilty of the Caine Mutiny ending. The Caine Mutiny ending being you're led throughout the entire script to believe that he's the hero and he's the villain. And then in the last scene they say, aha, you thought that was the villain, he's really the hero. And the one you thought was the hero is really the villain. And Seldes wrote, it never works. You can't mislead the audience that badly and then switch them successfully. And that was also a feature of the script, Fair Play. And I took it to heart. I mean, I really think it's true. I know a number of stories that validate that Seldes was right.
And the next one was This Will Do Nicely?
That was a story by a man named Flanagan who has written nonfiction books about I think the Year of the French was one, and he wrote a short story for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and that was This Will Do Nicely, and I did an adaptation of that, and it was very funny. And it starred Alan Young and Felicia Montelegre, who was Leonard Bernstein's wife.
And The Open Door?
The Open Door was the first CBS drama done in color with their color wheel system, which ended up not prevailing against the RCA color. And it was about a particular system, I think in Milwaukee, an honor system, prison honor system. Albert Salmi was the star of it, and it was an interesting show.
Why? What?
It was. I think the situation was an interesting situation to write.
Those three were directed by a man named William H. Brown. What do you remember about him?
I really didn't have much interaction with Bill Brown. I hardly. I mean, he sort of set about his work, and I was not terribly involved in the rehearsals. I didn't really get to talk to him until I happened to interview him for the Museum of Television and Radio years later. But he probably did more Studio Ones than any of the other directors.
Where were you during the broadcast of these shows?
I was there. I was in the booth.
And what was that like? What was it like in the booth of a live TV broadcast as it was going on?
Depends on whether you're in the booth with the director or you're in the booth with the sponsor. It makes a difference. I wrote a long piece about a Studio One that I wrote after Herb Brodkin had become the producer. It was called the Rice Sprout Song. And all kinds of disasters happened to that production. And the end was the most dismal ending. It was all supposed to be in China, and the actors were all in Chinese makeup, and it was done badly, and one actress was...
Well, let me take you through that one from the beginning, because that sounds like it. What was that show about? How did it come about?
It was called the Rice Sprout Song, and Herb Brodkin hired me to write it. And it was based on a novel by Eileen Chang, who lived in America, and it was about a family in rural China during a rice riot when they were starving. And Sidney Lumet directed it. And everybody in the cast, except for the male lead, John Colicos, who was Canadian, everybody else was a blacklisted actor. There was Michael Tolan and Dolores Sutton and Vivian Nathan and David Opatashu, and someone named David Stewart. And it was decided that we would make it as realistic as possible. And there was this huge snowstorm in it, and they decided to use artificial snow, which turned out to be disastrous for the actors because it was catching in their throats and they were coughing. And Olive Deering, who was back really for the first time since her blacklist period, they screwed up her makeup and she didn't want to come on, and Sidney had to actually pull her down onto the stage because the red light was about to go on, and she was very unhappy, and she sort of started mogrifying the script. Sections from Act 2 or in Act 1, and she was doing everything to render all the other actors terrified. And I sat in the sponsors booth with the guy from Westinghouse watching it. And the end of the story, after this woman played by Olive Deering has had her husband trampled to death in a rice riot, and her daughter taken away from her, and she's sent out to die in the Chinese snowstorm winter. And the last thing you see is her fading out as the white accumulates. And everything was so negative. And a guy from the advertising agency was looking at it and didn't know what to say to the sponsor. Finally he said, "You know, somehow I have the feeling she's going to make it."
Well, now, were you were you able to see how Sidney Lumet was handling all of these things as they were going wrong?
Uh, yes, of course. But in live television, you had no option but to barrel through. They couldn't change the kind of snow, and I'm sure he tried to talk to Olive in the act breaks, but she was just so upset because her mind fix was my final return to live television after years on the blacklist, and they made me look like a freak. She was very unhappy.
You mentioned that was the first show with Herb Brodkin. Before that, who had been the producer of the first studio one?
Felix Jackson.
And tell me about him.
Felix Jackson was a very cultivated man whose real field, I think, was music. He came to America in the same group of Germans as Billy Wilder. And he did movies. He married Deanna Durbin. I think he did 100 Men and a Girl, the Deanna Durbin film. Years later, I said to him, Felix, I got a great idea for a musical, but that based on 12 Angry Men. We could call it 12 Angry Men and a Girl. He didn't think that was funny at all. But Felix was a very cultivated man, and he was very easy to work with.
Was he a good producer?
Yeah, he was a good producer. And he moved to NBC in Burbank from Studio One, and I ultimately worked for him again years later with Frank Schaffner on a two-part DuPont on the Brinks robbery.
I wanted to go back, actually. You mentioned that the Open Door was the first Studio One done in color.
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about that, about what they had to do?
I thought that it was a color wheel. So it was an adaptation on the cameras, and it had to be an adaptation on the television set. I saw it only on a monitor in the studio. So the color looked wonderful, but I didn't, at that time, there were no color sets in homes. So it was an experiment for CBS, really.
So Herb Brodkin took over for Felix Jackson on the studio. How did he compare as a producer?
Well, Herb was a much different kind of man. Herb had been a scenic designer and had a long career in television. I think he did the U.S. Steel Hour, which was another dramatic anthology show. I worked for Herb on and off over the years. He was a real fighter. And he did some great shows. Judgment at Nuremberg, for example, is one of his. My second Playhouse 90 was with him. The Raider, it was called. And he gave every latitude to the writer. He was really terrific in that respect. And Ernie worked for him far more than I did, Ernie Kanoy. But he was a stand-up guy.
Maybe at this point I should ask you about the Blacklist, since it relates to the Rice Sprout song. Do you remember when you first became aware of what was going on?
I think when I went to work for Adventure and went in one day and everyone was talking about Jacob Loeb, I think that was his name.
Philip Loeb.
Philip Loeb. Jacob maybe was the name of the party plate. I don't remember.
Jake Goldberg, yeah, the actor on the Goldbergs.
Yeah. Who killed himself because the producers forced him off that show. That's when I became aware of it. And I became more aware of it, of course, when Studio One was going to hire me to do this submarine thing. Because Florence Britton, the story editor, sat me down in a screening room to show me an earlier submarine show that they had done on Studio One that Frank Schaffner had directed. And as the lights were coming up at the end of the show, Florence said to me, and we're going to do the same thing for you that we did with that writer. We're going to get you a clearance and put you on a submarine and let you go out on a cruise. And knowing that I had been a security risk in the Army, I immediately thought, that's it. My career is over before it starts. And the lights came up fully, and she looked at me and she said, what's wrong? Apparently I turned white. Of course, I didn't tell them about the security risk. And as I said earlier, it never came up. But it was very scary.
Why didn't you tell her that you'd been a security risk?
I thought that would make her fearful. I'm fearful enough. I didn't want to give them any reason to say maybe we shouldn't use him. If it's gonna be a problem, they'll hear about it, and when they hear about it, then whatever the consequences would be, they'll happen. I mean, Florence Britton was a terrific story editor, but she wasn't a friend. And as I say, it never came up.
Did you continue to be fearful that you might be blacklisted? Yourself?
No, I guess I figured if I got past Shakedown Cruise, I was okay. The whole security risk business was so ridiculous anyway, at least in my case. I had, at the age of 14, on 7 consecutive Tuesday nights, took the streetcar into the Loop in Chicago to take a hour-and-a-half course in radio script writing. And when it was time for me I volunteered for the Army, and I was given a list of 400 and some organizations which were considered to be Communist Front organizations, and one was this school that I had gone to when I was 14. So I filled out, I explained that, and they wouldn't accept my enlistment, and I became a security risk.
Now, CBS was known for requiring its employees to sign a loyalty oath. Did that come up in your case?
No, it didn't, because the contracts in those days for television writers were very much after the fact. The show went on, then maybe a month later or 2 months later, a contract would come through and you'd sign it. But in New York, television writers really worked on word of mouth. And the contracts were just afterthoughts at the business administration at CBS. So there were never contract negotiations before you did a show. The average length of time for writers who were working for Studio One, between the time the show went on the air and the next show that you wrote went on the air, was 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, you pitched a story, you wrote the script, it was rehearsed, and it was put on the air. 6 weeks. Now, 6 years isn't unusual.
Going back briefly to the Rice Sprouts song, that was 1957. How did Herb Brodkin get all of those blacklisted actors in there? Wasn't it still going on?
What happened really about that time was that the movie studios opened up. From early 50s on, studios were preventing all of their contract actors from appearing on television. And then around 57 or 58, the inroads of television were so great that the movie people said, it's better to subsume this medium than to try and fight it. They suddenly opened the floodgates and they let all of their contract players appear on television. People were flying out from California all the time in 57 and 58 and 59 to be on these shows. And McCarthy had already been censored, and things were quieting down. So it really wasn't a problem then, 57.
Can you tell me briefly about your involvement in the writers program at CBS and what that was?
In 1956, CBS decided it was cheaper to have the writers who worked for their shows on an annual salary. In exchange for that annual salary, we were obligated to produce outlines for 5 one-hour dramas, and to write up to 2 of them without additional compensation. There were 11 writers in the program. I was the last one in. And I did my 5 outlines, and I wrote 2 scripts, one of which I think was done. And then they canceled the program. In the meantime, during that 1 year on that salary, which was $11,000, I bought a house, my wife got pregnant, and then they ended the program. And then I was back on freelance. And all of the psychosomatic symptoms I'd been having while I was on that program disappeared.
Why were you having psychosomatic symptoms? What were they?
Oh, I was getting blisters on my fingers from stress, and I just didn't handle working for other people very well. I was much happier being freelance.
Interesting. Was that a collegial atmosphere among those 11 writers? Did you collaborate, interact?
We never met.
How is that?
It was all done out of CBS Business Affairs. And the funny thing, the really incredibly stupid thing that CBS did, is the Business Affairs Department would get the outlines that were produced by the writers in the program, but then they would just put them in with the regular outlines that came through the mail. So the story editors who read all these outlines had no idea whether this was coming from CBS's writer development program or not. Gilbert Ralston was the guy at Business Affairs who did it, and he said I had the best record of the other writers, and it was pretty poor in terms of how much value they got for their money. And so they canceled the program, and I was on my own.
Well, let me ask you about some of the other live shows you did during and after Studio One. Do you remember A House of His Own?
House of His Own was one. I did a spec script, and it was a fictionalized version of the situation that Nathan Leopold faced, of the Leopold and Loeb murders. Loeb was murdered shortly after he got into prison. Leopold became the man who really invented the prison library system, and he became such a positive force in dealing with prisons. But every time he came up for parole, in Chicago, they would beat the drums for this terrible crime that he committed, and they would always turn him down. And that's what led me to write it. I wanted to write about a man like that who had committed a notorious crime when he was very young, and who had redeemed himself in so many different ways, and yet every time he came up for parole, he was faced with this problem. Leopold finally did get out, by the way.
Do you remember anything about the production of that show, about Richard Boone, who started it?
It was all done in California. I had no input into it at all. I didn't know who did. Of course, I knew who Richard Boone was, but I watched it in my apartment. All I know is that the Ashley Agency sold it to them, and they did it.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break to change the tape and pick up again.